Welcome back to Journalism 102, and today we're going to talk about ethics in journalism. So if you were continuing on with a degree in journalism, you would take an entire course dedicated to this topic. But for the purposes of our discussion, we're really going to focus on some tools that you would use regardless of the type of journalism that you might do going forward. So if this is your last journalism class, there may very well be times in which you are trying to evaluate whether or not journalism that you encounter as an audience member is ethical or not. You may be involved in providing communications for a company that you work for. And so having a good foundation in how to make good, solid, ethical decisions as it relates to journalism will actually be valuable to you regardless of whether you continue in this degree. So how often do you think ethical issues arise for journalists? If you've basically said every day, you are absolutely correct. In fact, I would say multiple times a day, journalists are being asked to make decisions of an ethical nature. So we have to decide what it is that our organization stands for, how we as individuals want to be known as journalists, and decisions such as, do we move a water bottle out of the way when we're taking a photo? No, by the way. Do we name the family members of a suspect? Most likely, no, unless they have a direct involvement to the story. So, there are lots of different decisions that we make every single day as journalists. You've made decisions already in this class where you've had people who didn't want their faces used in the video or weren't able to let you use their interviews until they got approval from someone up the food chain. So you had to make some decisions about whether you would honor those requests or whether you wouldn't. And good ethical decision making involves not only just your gut feeling, what you think is the right thing to do, but a very thoughtful process of decision making, which we're going to explore today. So this week, of course, we have had many, many examples of ethical choices being made and a lot of criticism about some of the choices that have been made, especially when it turns out that news organizations have been wrong with some of the information that they have reported around the discussion of the Boston bombings. So this is a story in the New York Post. As you see here, the headline, authorities circulate photos of two men spotted carrying bags near site of Boston bombings. So we enhance this photo by drawing these target-like circles around their faces. And that raises questions about, is this ethical? In my class where we meet face-to-face, we had folks on both sides of the discussion. We had folks saying that absolutely, this is a time of real danger for people in this area. If authorities truly believe that these two young men might be involved in this, then we as journalists have an obligation to get that information out to the public. The other side of the room basically said, what does that mean? Carrying bags? I carry bags all the time. Does that make me a murder suspect or a bombing suspect? So you have painted almost literally a big target on the faces of these two young men. You can't take that back. Forever, they are going to be associated with this bombing, regardless of what happens. So some questions that we were asking in our discussion is this okay? Is it okay to use this photo? And as I said, we have people on both sides of that question. When would it be okay? So how much verification do we need to have from authorities that these are in fact the bombing suspects? At what point did it become acceptable to show the photos of the two young men who now authorities believe to have actually committed the crime. What makes publishing that photo a risky move? Not only is there the chance of a lawsuit potentially filed by those two young men, but also that you've put them in danger. It's a risky move because if you're wrong, what then happens to your news organization? So why was the Post blasted for doing this? For the very reasons we've just articulated, that how much verification did they have that authorities truly believe that these two young men were involved in the bombing? As it turns out, this information was not accurate. So, as you see here on their website, the Post started to include a little line that says, "Update, 2 men probed in Boston Marathon bombings cleared by investigators." So here's the issue. They became criticized when it was clear that these two young men were not part of the bombings. They were not criticized before the information came out indicating that these two young men were not associated. So it seems to me that what we're talking about here is the risk of being wrong is incredibly powerful. So no one was criticizing them for essentially putting the word out, or the criticism was very muted for publishing the photo with the red circles around it when they thought that these could be the suspects. And so my belief is the journalists in that newsroom believed that the information that they had from the sources that they received this photo from were in a position to know that these two young men were being taken very seriously as suspects. So do I think that journalists routinely just put information out for competitive pressures or because they're reckless? I really don't think that happens all that often. I think that most of the time journalists are reporting information in good faith. So now the question becomes, did they make it right by posting that additional update that says, sorry, we were wrong, these two young men were not part of this? Many people in our class discussion this week said no, they did not make it right, that there's long-lasting damage potentially to these two young men's reputations, that their class was split again on whether or not the audience would forgive them. In some ways, it's become that trust of journalists and their credibility and their ability to get it right has diminished to the point where, people probably expect information to be wrong almost as often as it's right. And that's sad, but it certainly has some historical perspective and context. Journalists, especially in big breaking news situations, there's an expression called the fog of war. So in the middle of a war, it's very difficult to determine what exactly is happening. And in some ways, a big, massive breaking story like the Boston bombings falls into that category. We have so much information coming into you that it's very difficult to verify and vet everything essentially in real time. But what does this mean for journalism as a whole? I think every incident like this chips away just a little bit more at the public's trust of journalists. And that's why it is so very important to be the news organization or to be the journalist that gets it right a lot more often than you get it wrong. So what are the options for journalists? On the one hand, we have these pressures to inform the public with the best information we have at the time, to help keep people safe. We would put out pictures of suspects. At the same time, how do we make ethical decisions? If we are 100% confident in our sources, we feel really good about the information they've shared with us, what else do we need to do before we make that decision to publish information, photos, etc. So we fall back on journalism ethics. And journalism ethics for our course is defined as a decision based on ideas of right and wrong. So why is it that we talk about ideas of right and wrong? Because all of us come with different moral backgrounds, different societal backgrounds, where we believe certain things are acceptable or not acceptable. And so just like in a classroom of student journalists, you're going to have many different viewpoints on whether or not to publish something. You will find that in any setting. And so the idea is for all of us to talk this through and discuss the various aspects of this decision. Who are the stakeholders? Who are the people for which this story matters? The journalists are a stakeholder. The audience is a stakeholder. The company you work for is a stakeholder. We could go on and on with the list, but you want to consider as many of the stakeholders as possible and the impact of your decision on those stakeholders, bringing in the viewpoints of as many people as possible before you make a major ethical decision. So it's a process by which journalists come up with a defensible decision. So what generally is true is that when you have made a choice, if you can defend that choice, people are much more likely to at least appreciate the fact that you went through a process. I think for journalism organizations, they're defending that decision to the public. So when questioned by the public, being willing to put up that little red line of copy that says update, these two people are not suspects. That's a part of this whole process of being transparent and telling the audience what you know and how you know it. Being willing to defend to them when you've made the choice to show the video of the bloody bodies versus not show the video of the bloody bodies. There are definitely arguments to be made on both sides of that. You want to show how absolutely horrible this was, but at the same time, at what point will you stop showing how horrible it is? Do we need to see those photos 6 months from now? Do we need to see them during programming when children might be watching? So all of these things play into your ethical decisions. We have a great foundation for ethical decision making as journalists, and it's called the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. It's been around for decades, and it is a very useful sort of rubric to use to evaluate the decisions that you're making as a journalist. So the first, seek truth and report it. Second, minimize harm. Third, be accountable. And fourth, act independently. We're going to take each of these one by one. So if you're trying to take notes, don't worry about trying to scribble these all down right now. So number one, sort of the prime directive, is to seek truth and report it. That's actually harder than it may sound. And why is that? Well, we just talked about that. So, the Post, I am confident, was trying to report the truth when they put those photos up for the public to see, put the photo up for the public to see. It turns out that information was not accurate. So we're only as good as the information that we receive from the best sources available. Just this week, again, Texas explosion, inaccurate information first published. The information that this was somehow potentially related to a terrorist attack. Again, I don't think that any of the journalists involved in reporting that information deliberately set out to deceive the audience. The Boston bombing, many, many examples of where the information that was first reported turns out to be inaccurate. Everything from death tolls to injury counts. One of the biggest examples of this in our history is weapons of mass destruction. Journalists reported based on sources that they felt knew enough to have the story right that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Turns out that information was wrong. the Benghazi incident, the Petraeus affair. We could go on and on, all the way back to, the early 19th century. There are many examples of false information being reported, not because journalists didn't care, not because journalists were worried more about profits than about accuracy, but because this is the process by which journalists do their jobs. They report the best possible version of the truth that they can at the time. And so what really we need to keep our eyes on as journalists is reporting over time leads to truth. We do know that the Texas explosion was not an act of terrorism. We do know that those two young men featured in that post photo were not the suspects. It goes on and on. We do know these things because reporters keep working the story until they get it right, until they get at the best possible version of the truth and get it out to the public. The second tenet of the Society of Professional Journalists Code is to minimize harm. Now, this is again a little bit more complex than you may not think of on first glance. So many stories harm someone. If you do a story about the mayor of your town embezzling funds from the city's coffers, that story will harm him. He will lose reputation. He will, potentially go to jail. These things are all things that we would consider harmful to us as human beings. But that doesn't mean that we don't report the information. What you see here is that we want to minimize harm. So we want to get the story out, tell the story in the way that's most valuable to the audience, but at the same time, try not to exacerbate harm. So what we ask journalists to do is consider the journalistic purpose of the information you are about to report. In the case of the mayor, there is a journalistic purpose for reporting that. He's stealing from taxpayers. We as taxpayers need to know that. He's not, leading the city properly. We as voters deserve to know that. So there are many reasons why you would report that information. Was there a journalistic purpose to showing the faces of those men? Again, this is something that you have to determine by bringing in all of these different viewpoints. But the argument made was that if these were the actual suspects, knowing what they looked like was valuable information for the public. So that was their journalistic purpose. Now, as it turns out, they were wrong. So that calls into question, how much verification did they do? How many viewpoints did they bring into the discussion? But at the end of the day, what you want to do is you want to, again, create a defensible answer. So if you've had these discussions and you've come up on the side of publish, at least you have gone through this process and potentially looked at ways to minimize harm. Would it have minimized harm to think of some other way to zero in on those suspects other than putting the big red target-like circles? Maybe that is a way to minimize harm. Maybe a more subtle box around them could have been a better solution. I don't know. But you want to have these discussions to try to figure out how can we still get the information out, still get the story out without doing unnecessary harm. Number 3 is be accountable. So who are we really talking about being accountable to? Well, number 1 is our audience. That's who we serve. At the end of the day, that should be the biggest concern for us, is that we are making a decision that best serves our audience. The reality of it is, though, that there are lots of stakeholders. There are your fellow journalists. There is your own, credibility. There's your company. There are the players within the story. So in the mayoral example, you have the taxpayers, you have the voters, you have the other members of City Hall, who was supposed to be watching over the expenditures of the mayor. You know, how did this happen? You have investigators, law enforcement. So there are many, many stakeholders to consider and think about. There's the mayor's family. You know, there are his aides. So all kinds of people to think about who you need to be accountable for. So whose viewpoint should you be considering in this? So an argument could be made that adding that correction at the bottom of that picture that the Daily Post published is an example of accountability, and understanding by this news organization that they have an obligation to their stakeholders to get the story right. Number 4 is act independently. Another one of those tenets which has more than meets the eye. So we need to think as journalists every time we are writing a story is, what are your influences? How might you likely be bringing your own subjective viewpoints to this story? So that's why we often recommend that you try to stay away from stories for which you have a passionate viewpoint. Now, we're all going to have opinions about stories, so if we never did a story for which we had an opinion, that would narrow us too much, too significantly. You know, can a journalist ever be completely objective? I have a lot of friends, and I believe it too, that say no. I mean, every time we make a choice to use a quote or not use a quote, to use a video clip or not use a video clip, we're making subjective decisions. So we cannot be completely objective, but you want to guard yourself from, you know, interviewing your best friend for a story. Why? Because if your best friend says something that makes him or her look like an idiot, how likely are you to use it? You're not. So if you feel passionately about a new school uniform decision, let's say your kids are going to school and they're going to be required to wear school uniforms. If you feel passionately about this, this is not a story for you. You know, your kid goes to that school, you tell your news manager, this is probably not a story for me. I'm too close to this issue. So one of the things that we talk about in journalism is transparency, and I referenced it just a little bit earlier. So let's say for some reason you are an avid beer maker and you want to do a story about the craft of making beer. So one of the ways in which it might still be possible for you to do this story is to reveal to your audience your connection to craft brewing. So incorporate the top of the story or the bottom of the story a little note to the audience that you yourself are a craft brewer and, you know, have been doing it for the last 7 years. So that sort of puts the audience on notice that this is where you're coming from. So then they can evaluate the information more fully because they know what viewpoint you're bringing to the table. So the idea of transparency is telling people what you know, how you know it, as well as what you don't know. So one of the things that I found to be really refreshing in the whole coverage of the Boston bombings was NBC was one of the networks that did not report inaccurately that a suspect was in custody. I think it was on the second day after the bombing. Many other news organizations did, and one of their reporters, Pete Williams, kept putting out on social media, we do not have an arrest verified. We will not report that we have an arrest verified until we can get that information nailed down. So that makes me feel much better about them as a news organization, that they didn't have it. They didn't have what turned out to be false information, and so they were not going to report it. So that's being transparent with your audience, telling them what you know or what you don't know. So the tenets of the SPJ Code of Ethics are valuable tools to use whenever you're confronted with an ethical decision. is consider the stakeholders, consider the people affected by this, consider the journalistic purpose of reporting or not reporting the information, and consider your own biases and what you might be bringing into the reporting that you need to be aware of as a journalist to make sure that you're providing that best possible, most accurate version of the truth available at the time.